Madrid, autumn of 1834. The palace was silent in that peculiar way. Death demands a silence so thick that it seemed to press on the eardrums, broken only by the faint rustle of heavy silk curtains and the distant ticking of a French clock. Outside, the city was suffocating under a late September heat, the air thick with the mingled scents of horse dung from the carriageways and the faintly sweet, rotting tang that drifted up from the Manzanares. But here, within the royal bedchamber, a different scent dominated. Camphor, rosemary, and the unmistakable metallic bite of recently shed blood. The king was dead. Ferdinand VII, ruler of Spain, scourge to his enemies and disappointment to his allies, had drawn his last ragged breath hours earlier. Yet my work, the work of the royal physician, was far from over. Death had not ended his demands on those bound to serve him. They had sent for me without explanation, a summons delivered in the clipped, urgent tone reserved for matters of both political and mortal gravity. I had tended to the king's illnesses for years, the gout, the breathless fevers, the mysterious digestive ailments, but nothing in my training had prepared me for the request that awaited. When I entered, she was there. Queen Regent Maria Cristina stood beside the bed, her eyes glistening not only with grief, but with something sharper. Fear, perhaps, or the weight of an impossible decision. She wore deep mourning black, the crepe veil drawn back, just enough for me to see her pale lips move, as if forming a prayer. "We must preserve him," she said, her voice low and deliberate. But there was no mistaking her meaning when her gaze dropped not to the king's face, but to the shrouded expanse beneath the silk sheets. The air seemed to constrict in my lungs. Even in death, Ferdinand's presence carried a suffocating gravity. His head rested heavily to one side, the lips pulled into the faintest sneer, as though mocking the living from the other side of the veil. But it was not his face that the Queen feared history might forget. With a small, decisive nod, she motioned for me to proceed. 2 footmen stepped forward and peeled back the embroidered coverlet. What lay revealed was an object that had haunted whispers in palace corridors for decades, an anatomical monstrosity that had defined Ferdinand as surely as his policies, a physical emblem of a reign both deformed and destructive. I had heard the rumours, of course. Everyone in the palace had. But the reality was something far beyond rumour, a grotesque amalgam of nature's excess and error. Even through the pallor of death, it seemed a living thing, its proportions alien, its form both exaggerated and misshapen. My hands, gloved in kid leather, trembled as I prepared my instruments. Preserving a royal corpse was never a simple matter in 19th century Spain. The Catholic tradition demanded respect for the body. The political reality demanded it endure the public gaze during funeral rites, and the court's macabre fascination demanded certain particulars be safeguarded for posterity. In other courts of Europe, this might mean ensuring the monarch's face remained serene, or that the hands were folded just so. In Madrid, for Ferdinand, it meant something else entirely. On a nearby table, glass jars of spirits and perfumed oils awaited. The air was thick with the acrid sting of ethanol and the floral edge of crushed lavender, a futile attempt to mask the underlying truth that the human body, however royal, is mortal and quick to decay. Wax candles guttered in the damp air, their smoke curling upward like questions no one dared to voice. As I worked, my mind betrayed me, wandering toward the stories I had heard over the years, stories whispered by scullery maids and muttered between foreign diplomats over brandy, stories of special cushions, of bridal screams muffled behind velvet curtains, of the king's desperate, humiliating efforts to fulfill the one duty that had eluded him, producing an heir. Every court breeds rumours. Only a few survive long enough to harden into legend. Ferdinand's legend had been carved into the consciousness of Spain, not by marble statues or military victories, but by what I now handled with clinical care. It was then I realized this task was more than preservation. It was an act of political, embalming the safeguarding of an intimate symbol that had shaped not just the man, but the fate of a nation. His anatomy had been both his pride and his prison, a grotesque mirror of his reign, outsized, misshapen, and ruinous to all it touched. Outside, somewhere in the labyrinth of palace corridors, the muffled sounds of official mourning echoed. The clink of ceremonial swords, the shuffle of courtiers in dark silk, the faint sobbing of those whose grief was as much performance as sentiment. Spain would soon file past his coffin, heads bowed, eyes averted perhaps in sorrow, perhaps in relief. Few would guess that the hidden relic, being so carefully preserved within, as I sealed the final stitches, I thought not of the man whose power had reached across oceans, but of the cruel symmetry that had defined him. In life, his body had dictated his politics. In death, it would dictate his memory. And I, the physician, had become its unwilling custodian. Somewhere in the shadows, history waited ready to record Ferdinand's name alongside his wars, his betrayals, and his grotesque inheritance. But I knew, in that moment, that what lay preserved beneath these silk sheets would haunt Spain far longer than any treaty or decree. Part 2. Born of a poisoned bloodline, El Escorial, the 14th of October, 1784, the day a prince was born into the most gilded prison imaginable. The bells of Madrid rang for hours, their peals echoing across the slate roofs and monastery walls of the vast palace complex. From the outside, it was a day of celebration, the arrival of Charles IV and Queen Maria Luisa's first surviving son, a future king of Spain. But within the thick granite walls of El Escorial, the child's birth was less a blessing than the latest installment in a centuries-long gamble with fate. The Bourbon and Habsburg dynasties had, for generations, treated marriage less as a matter of love or alliance than as a family business one that kept property, titles, and blood pure. In practice, it was a dangerous breeding program. Cousin married cousin, uncles wed nieces. The family tree was not so much a branching oak as a twisted vine curling in on itself. By the time Ferdinand VII entered the world, his genetic inheritance was a powder keg of latent disorders. Spain was no stranger to the consequences of such inbreeding. The ghost of Charles II, El Hechizado the Bewitched, still haunted the court. That tragic monarch, born a century earlier, had been so physically and mentally impaired by his lineage that he could barely chew his food or comprehend matters of state. Ferdinand's birth was seen by some as an escape from that cursed legacy, by others as merely another turn of the screw. The infant's first months gave little cause for alarm, at least outwardly. He was pale but sturdy, with the Bourbon nose and a curious, watchful expression. Yet the royal midwives whispered in the dark corners of the nursery about certain peculiarities, not deformities exactly, but hints of something unusual. No one dared speak of them in detail. In a court where a misplaced word could mean exile, such matters were wrapped in euphemism. Life at El Escorial was designed to breed both reverence and fear. Built by Philip II in the 16th century, the palace monastery complex was a monument to Spanish Catholicism's austere grandeur. Cold stone corridors, cavernous chapels echoing with Latin chants, and gardens clipped into geometric perfection. For a child, it was a place where joy had to be smuggled into stolen moments between lessons and rituals. Ferdinand's education began almost as soon as he could walk. Tutors drilled him in Latin, history, theology, and the rigid etiquette of the Spanish court. Every bow had a prescribed angle, every glance a proper duration. But beneath this lacquer of discipline, another lesson was being learned, one not in the official curriculum. Children are quick to detect the unspoken. And Ferdinand soon realized that there was something about him that made adults exchange sidelong glances when they thought he wasn't looking. By the time he reached adolescence, the whispers were harder to ignore. Court physicians examined him more frequently than his siblings, and not always for the ailments they claimed. He overheard their low voices behind closed doors, the murmur of peculiar development and exceptional dimensions, phrases that were more clinical than descriptive, yet carried an unmistakable charge of unease. In another age, in another culture, such an unusual anatomical feature might have been celebrated as a mark of virility. But in late 18th century Spain, shaped by Catholic morality and neoclassical ideals of beauty, excess was grotesque, not glorious. The Greeks had once sculpted their gods and heroes with modest proportions, believing that refinement and control were signs of civilization. Ferdinand's gift, if one could call it, that was a violation of those proportions, an affront to symmetry itself. The court was a world where gossip was currency, and even the tightest secrecy leaked in rivulets through servants' chatter, diplomatic dispatches, and foreign visitors' letters. French envoys wrote home about the oddity of the Spanish air. A British observer recorded in his diary that the young prince possessed a mark of distinction that, while remarkable, may yet prove his undoing. The boy's own awareness of his difference grew not in a single moment of revelation, but as a slow, creeping certainty. It shaped the way he moved, the way he dressed, even the way he stood in the presence of others. Shame, once it takes root, blooms quickly in the hothouse of a royal court. And for Ferdinand, shame was compounded by the sense that his body was not entirely his own, that it was already a matter of state. A secret jealously guarded not for his sake, but for the dynasties. Behind the ceremonial portraits, behind the public appearances, the future king was already forming the first layers of the armor that would later define him. Suspicion, pride twisted by humiliation, and a ruthless instinct for self-protection. The poisoned bloodline had given him life, but it had also set in motion the private torment that would one day shape the fate of Spain. And in the marble corridors of El Escorial, where every step echoed like a verdict, the young prince learned that the real inheritance of kings was not wealth or power, it was the burden of secrets too dangerous to name. Part 3. The Shaping of a Tyrant. By the time Ferdinand reached his mid-teens, the peculiarities of his body were no longer just a private matter, whispered among physicians and midwives. They had become an unspoken feature of palace life, a shadow that followed him into every room. In the rigid hierarchy of the Spanish court, no one would dare openly mock the heir to the throne, but laughter, in such places, rarely needs a voice. It lived in the pauses after a conversation, in the way eyes shifted away too quickly, in the too polite smiles of foreign dignitaries. The court of Charles IV was a theatre of contradictions. The king himself was affable but weak, more interested in the hunt than in governance. His queen, Maria Louisa of Parma, wielded influence with an appetite that was as notorious in private as it was in politics. She openly favoured her confidant and lover, Manuel de Godoy, the so-called Prince of the Peace, whose rise from minor noble to virtual ruler of Spain scandalized Europe. Young Ferdinand, watching from the gilded shadows, saw in his mother's brazen liaison a blueprint for betrayal. But if the politics of the court taught him that loyalty was a currency quickly spent, his own body taught him something darker. That vulnerability invites cruelty. The awareness of his condition was constant, not just in moments of intimacy, but in the mundane rhythms of daily life. Dressing for formal occasions was an exercise in strategic concealment. The cut of his breeches had to be altered, the fabric reinforced, all under the guise of royal tailoring. Servants tasked with his wardrobe pretended not to notice, but the careful way they avoided eye contact told him they noticed everything. Paranoia began as a seed and rooted itself deeply. He saw insult where there was none, interpreted formality as mockery, and began cataloguing imagined enemies in his mind. Some of these suspicions had a grain of truth. There were indeed jokes made in the servants' quarters, rumours traded among junior courtiers, coded references slipped into the chatter of foreign embassies. But Ferdinand did not distinguish between idle talk and genuine threat to him. They were the same. One incident became the stuff of whispered legend within the palace. A young page, barely more than a boy, accidentally entered Ferdinand's chambers while the prince was changing. What might have been excused as a clumsy mistake became a calculated display of vengeance. The page was flogged until he could no longer stand, his family stripped of their court positions and banished from Madrid. The lesson was brutal and clear. To witness the prince's shame was to pay dearly for it. Historians often debate whether Ferdinand's cruelty was a product of his upbringing, his anatomy, or his temperament. In truth, it was all three, braided together so tightly they became indistinguishable. A lifetime of being observed, measured, and whispered about had forged a man for whom control was not just a desire, but a necessity. If others saw him as an object, he would ensure they feared the object they beheld. It was around this time that his tutors began noting changes in his demeanor. The boy who once played chess with cautious patience now played as if the sole purpose of the game was to trap and destroy, even at the cost of his own pieces. Lessons in history became opportunities to identify betrayals by kings past. Lessons in theology were twisted into justifications for punishing enemies as agents of divine will. The Bourbon bloodline had produced its share of flawed rulers, but Ferdinand was developing into something different, not simply inept or self-indulgent, but actively vindictive. His authority, still limited as heir, was nonetheless enough to ruin lives. A valet who displeased him might find himself reassigned to a malaria-ridden outpost in the Americas. A stable master who laughed too loudly in his presence would discover his family's pension revoked. These were not the grand political purges of an absolute monarch, but the petty cruelties of a man testing the reach of his power. The royal physicians, bound by both professional duty and political fear, continued to monitor his condition, documenting its changes in meticulous coded language. Some believed that his anatomy was still developing abnormally, possibly due to a rare endocrine disorder. Others suspected that the very inbreeding meant to preserve the purity of the royal line had instead concentrated every latent flaw into his body. Whatever the cause, the effect was the same. Ferdinand grew more self-conscious, more calculating, more ruthless, and in the long galleries of the palace, lined with oil portraits of ancestors whose eyes seemed to follow every step, Ferdinand learned to return the gaze to watch others just as he was watched. Observation became his weapon, suspicion his constant companion. The boy who had once been the subject of court gossip was becoming a man who would control every whisper, even if he had to silence it with fear. The transformation was not yet complete, but the outlines of the tyrant were already there. His reign had not begun, but in the private chambers of El Escorial, the foundations were being laid in paranoia, humiliation, and the cold, methodical practice of retribution. Spain did not yet know it, but its future king was already rehearsing the cruelty he would one day unleash on an entire kingdom. Part 4. A Marriage of Horror. Maria Antonia. In 1802, at the age of 17, Ferdinand was presented to Europe as a young man stepping into destiny. His engagement to Princess Maria Antonia of Naples and Sicily was heralded as the union of two powerful Bourbon branches, a match that would strengthen dynastic ties and, more importantly, secure the future of the Spanish crown. For the court, it was a political triumph. For Ferdinand, it was an opportunity, or perhaps a test he had both longed for and dreaded. The betrothal was arranged when the pair were still teenagers. Maria Antonia arrived in Madrid with the bright-eyed optimism of a princess raised on romantic notions and courtly tales. She had been told her intended was nicknamed El Deseado, the desired one, by his supporters, and in her sheltered mind, this conjured visions of a gallant, noble prince. Her upbringing, steeped in Catholic propriety, had prepared her for ceremony and decorum, but not for the reality awaiting her. Their wedding was a masterpiece of spectacle. The cathedral glowed with candlelight, the air thick with incense and the low chant of choirs. Nobles in silks and jewels filled the pews, while in the streets the people shouted blessings as the newlyweds passed in their gilded carriage. It was an image painted for posterity, the perfect couple poised to secure Spain's royal line. But the image shattered on the wedding night. In the private chambers prepared for their union, Maria Antonia encountered a scene that would remain seared into her memory. Before Ferdinand himself even entered, her ladies-in-waiting were approached by his valet with a strange request. Certain customary preparations must be made. Into the chamber were brought specially designed cushions, glass bottles of scented oils, and a selection of implements whose shapes and purposes baffled the women. They were told these were aids for royal comfort, but their true function was less romantic. They were devices designed to make consummation possible without causing injury. Maria Antonia, cloistered and inexperienced, had been given only the vaguest education about marital duties. No one had warned her of what she would see when Ferdinand removed his clothing. When that moment came, the reaction was immediate and visceral. She screamed, a high, keening cry that echoed off the gilded walls. Witnesses later recalled her pressing herself against the wall, hands raised as if to ward off an attacker, crying, "Monstru, monster." The accounts, hidden in private letters between court physicians, paint a scene more surgical than sensual. Ferdinand's anatomy grotesquely outsized, oddly shaped, with strange curvatures and unexplained growths, was not merely shocking, it was threatening. The custom cushions were arranged to support him, preventing injury to himself. Oils were applied to reduce the risk of tearing. Laudanum was administered to the bride to sedate her into compliance. What should have been the symbolic consummation of a royal alliance became a clinical procedure carried out under the eyes of physicians trained less in intimacy than in mitigation of harm. Maria Antonia endured it with rigid, drugged stillness, her mind retreating far from the bed where her body lay. This was not an isolated ordeal. In the months that followed, their attempts at producing an heir became ritualized exercises in trauma. Ferdinand's physicians would prepare the chamber, arranging the cushions and oils, dosing the queen until she was pliant, but conscious enough to participate. The king approached the act with the grim determination of a soldier facing a battle he could not win outright, while Maria Antonia braced herself for pain and humiliation. It did not take long for her to seek refuge in laudanum beyond these encounters. At first, she used it only on the appointed nights. Soon, it became her daily escape, dulling the sharp edges of a life that had turned from promise to prison. By modern understanding, she was suffering severe sexual trauma compounded by addiction, yet in the court of 19th century Spain, such suffering was invisible, hidden behind the rigid facade of royal duty. Ferdinand, for his part, interpreted her fear not as the natural response to pain, but as a personal affront. Her reluctance was, in his mind, a challenge to his masculinity and a threat to his royal mission. He became more forceful, more insistent, introducing restraints crafted by the same artisans who fashioned his saddles and hunting gear. These devices, padded with silk but cold in their purpose, were meant to hold her still, to prevent her from pulling away. The irony was bitter. The very condition that had made Ferdinand an object of mockery in his youth now made him a figure of dread in his own marriage. And yet in the eyes of the court, the burden was hers to bear. She was a queen, her body was an instrument of state, and failure to produce an heir was a political as well as personal failure. Outside their private chambers, the world went on as if nothing were amiss. Banquets were held, portraits painted, treaties signed. But within those silken walls, night after night, a silent war was waged, one of anatomy against endurance, of shame against survival, and in that war, neither victor nor vanquished would emerge whole. Part 5. Obsession, Miscarriages, and Conspiracy. Ferdinand's fixation on producing an heir began as a political necessity, but quickly hardened into a personal obsession. In the rigid hierarchy of monarchy, virility was more than a matter of pride, it was proof of divine favour. Every month that passed without a pregnancy became, in his mind, an indictment. Every sign of Maria Antonia's reluctance was reframed as sabotage. He began to seek answers far beyond the realm of medicine. Court physicians still attended to the preparations for intimacy, but now they were joined by astrologers, alchemists, and mystics whose presence in the palace unsettled even the most cynical courtiers. In Ferdinand's mind, science and superstition could be harnessed together, each shoring up the other's failures. One week, a surgeon from Florence would be called to examine him, offering diagrams and surgical sketches meant to correct his form. The next, a bearded mystic in saffron robes would be ushered in under cover of night, scattering incense and chanting invocations in a language no one in the room understood. Ferdinand kept a notebook part medical journal, part astrological chart where he recorded each attempt. The phase of the moon, the herbs administered, the positions tried, the results obtained. Maria Antonia was not consulted in these decisions. Her role was to endure them. Sometimes this meant submitting to the usual laudanum-assisted procedures. Sometimes it meant kneeling in prayer before a relic while the king circled her, reciting prayers that slid halfway into pagan incantations. In 1804, the court erupted in celebration. Maria Antonia was with child. Bells rang in Madrid. Masses were said in every parish. Ferdinand was transformed overnight from a tense, suspicious man into a beaming, magnanimous monarch in waiting. But the joy was short-lived. In her 4th month, Maria Antonia miscarried. The official explanation spoke of the fragility of her constitution, a diplomatic phrase to shield the truth. Privately, physicians admitted that the mechanical strain of Ferdinand's anatomy, combined with her already weakened state, had made the pregnancy's loss almost inevitable. The Queen herself was bedridden for weeks, her laudanum use deepening into dependency. 2 years later, hope returned. Against the odds, Maria Antonia conceived again. This time, Ferdinand doubled his efforts to protect the pregnancy. He consulted court astronomers to determine the safest days for conjugal contact. He commissioned a gold amulet engraved with both Christian and astrological symbols, which she was ordered to wear at all times. But in early 1805, disaster struck once more. The second miscarriage was more violent, more public. Maria Antonia carried the child nearly to term before a labour of such agony erupted that her screams could be heard down the marble corridors. Servants whispered that the birthing chamber looked like a battlefield by morning. She survived, but something in her broke that day. From that moment, she became a spectral presence in the palace, thin, pale, eyes sunken into shadow. She prayed constantly, sometimes for hours on her knees, lips moving in frantic silence. Confessors reported that she begged forgiveness for sins unnamed, convinced her body was cursed to reject the king's seed. Ferdinand's reaction to the miscarriages revealed the depth of his self-absorption. Compassion never entered the equation. Instead, he accused her of deliberately preventing conception, of taking secret herbs, of moving in ways designed to provoke miscarriage, of secretly sympathizing with liberal factions who wished to see his line extinguished. These accusations were not confined to private rage. They became whispers in the corridors, passed from one ambitious courtier to another, each retelling sharpening the edge of suspicion. The Queen's ladies in waiting were questioned, her correspondence intercepted, her rooms searched for contraband. Then came the rumors of poison. Some whispered that Ferdinand himself, frustrated with her failures, had ordered her slow elimination. Others claimed she had been the target of political enemies seeking to destabilize the Bourbon line. The death of the royal apothecary days after her passing in 1807 only fanned the flames. Found lifeless in his chambers, he left behind a letter that was seized immediately by the king's agents. Its contents were never revealed. In public, Ferdinand wore the mask of a grieving husband. In private, he appeared relieved, even animated, as his advisors began discreetly making inquiries about potential new brides. Maria Antonia's death was listed as the result of fever and delicate constitution, but the truth was far uglier. She had died of despair, her body worn down by trauma, her mind by paranoia not entirely her own. Her funeral mass was attended by the great families of Spain, their black-clad figures filling the cathedral like rows of silent crows. Yet, even as the incense rose in somber coils toward the vaulted ceiling, negotiations for Ferdinand's next marriage had already begun. The quest for an heir and the cycle of cruelty it demanded was far from over. Part 6. Political betrayals and growing monstrosity. Maria Antonia's body had barely cooled before Ferdinand was once again maneuvering for advantage, not only in marriage, but in politics. By 1807, Spain was a fractured chessboard of weak kingship, unpopular ministers, and foreign interference, each piece moving toward inevitable collapse. Ferdinand, though not yet crowned, was already rehearsing the role of absolute monarch. The court seethed with resentment toward his father, Charles IV, and the king's powerful favourite, Manuel de Godoy. Many nobles saw Ferdinand as their rallying point, the instrument to remove both. They called themselves Los Fernandinos, whispering over port and cigars about restoring Spain's dignity under a new ruler. Ferdinand played the role of the reluctant saviour well, nodding gravely at their entreaties, promising reform and a return to traditional values. But even among his would-be allies, there was unease. They had begun to notice the same traits that had marked his private life, a tendency to see insult everywhere, a vindictiveness that could turn on friend as easily as foe, and an ever-present hunger for control. That October, the Elascorial conspiracy came to light. Ferdinand had been plotting to overthrow his father with the help of an unlikely ally, Napoleon Bonaparte. Correspondence between the prince and the French emperor outlined his willingness to trade concessions for support. When the plot was uncovered, the young prince's response revealed a defining truth of his character. Loyalty was a disposable commodity. He did not defend his co-conspirators. He did not deny his own role. Instead, he confessed to everything, named every man involved, and begged his parents for forgiveness. Those who had risked their lives for his cause found themselves imprisoned or exiled. Ferdinand emerged tarnished but intact, having sacrificed others to preserve himself. This episode would become a template for his reign: use people for personal gain, then discard them without hesitation. And as his political machinations unfolded, so too did his private affliction. The royal physicians who still attended him began noting, in secret, coded records that his anatomy was continuing to change. What had once been merely grotesque was becoming monstrous. Some modern historians suspect he may have suffered from a condition similar to macrophalia, combined with an endocrine disorder, possibly influenced by the generations of inbreeding that had shaped his family tree. At the time, no one dared give it a name. The records speak in euphemisms: growth unchecked, unusual girth, increasing irregularity of form. Intimacy, already difficult, was now nearly impossible without elaborate mechanical intervention. An intervention there was. The palace workshops, normally the realm of craftsmen producing saddles, armor, and ceremonial weapons, became a hybrid between a surgical atelier and an armorer's forge. Leather straps, adjustable cushions, and metal frameworks were commissioned with the secrecy of state arms projects. The artisans, sworn to silence, worked behind heavy oak doors guarded by soldiers. Those who completed the commissions were rewarded handsomely, and some, disturbingly, were later found dead under mysterious circumstances. In 1808, Spain's political instability reached its breaking point. Napoleon's armies crossed the border, and in a matter of weeks, Ferdinand found himself stripped of the throne he had schemed so long to claim. Forced to abdicate in favour of Napoleon's brother Joseph, he was sent into captivity in France. For Ferdinand, exile was not merely political humiliation, it was a personal exposure. French intelligence had amassed detailed files on the Spanish royal family, including humiliatingly his anatomical abnormality. At the Château de Valençay, where he would spend the next 6 years, French physicians examined him with a scientific detachment that bordered on cruelty. Freed from the deference of the Spanish court, they measured, sketched, and documented every irregularity. Their reports, later found in Napoleonic archives, describe an organ so disproportionate and misshapen that it seemed almost mythological in nature. They speculated on causes: glandular disorders, genetic collapse, even rare developmental anomalies seen in exotic animals, but almost never in men. For Ferdinand, each examination was a fresh assault. The humiliation compounded the paranoia that had already taken root in Madrid. Now, every guard's smirk, every servant's sideways glance was evidence of mockery. He began to keep to his rooms, emerging only when necessary, preferring to write long, self-pitying letters to European relatives about his unjust confinement letters, in which the suffering of his people barely merited a mention. Outside the walls of Valençay, Spain burned. Guerrilla fighters bled for a crown whose absent owner spent his days obsessing over personal indignities and drafting lists of potential brides who might accept his special circumstances. He made careful inquiries into their family histories, favoring women who had already borne children in previous marriages, proof, in his mind, that their fault could not be used as an excuse if no heir appeared. By the time Napoleon's fortunes faltered and Ferdinand returned to Spain in 1814, the man who stepped out of exile was not the same prince who had entered it. He had been humiliated, dissected literally and figuratively, and in the process, the flaws in his character had hardened into something more dangerous. The paranoia was no longer a private habit, it was his governing principle. The cruelty was no longer confined to the unlucky few who crossed him in the palace. It was ready to be unleashed on a nation. Spain, jubilant at his return, would soon learn that the king they had restored was both more broken and more dangerous than the one they had lost. Part 7. Return to Power and the Second Marriage. Maria Isabel. When Ferdinand returned to Spain in 1814, it was to scenes of near religious fervour. Crowds flooded the streets of Madrid, showering his carriage with flowers, weeping openly as though the prodigal son had returned to save the nation. For many, his restoration was symbolic. A king who had survived Napoleon's grip must surely be the chosen one to restore Spain's dignity. But Ferdinand's mind was not on rebuilding the country. His first priority, almost before his crown was secure, was the same as it had been before exile: securing an heir. Years of captivity had not dampened his obsession. If anything, they had made it burn hotter. The throne was worthless without a successor to keep it in Bourbon hands. The search for a second wife was not conducted in the open. This was a diplomatic negotiation cloaked in velvet secrecy, as Ferdinand's reputation, both political and personal, preceded him. Many royal houses in Europe had heard whispers of his condition, and potential matches withdrew quietly after discreet inquiries with court physicians or ambassadors. Finally, an agreement was reached. Maria Isabel of Portugal, his cousin. She was 19, fresh from the Lisbon court, with the docility and piety Ferdinand's advisors assured him would be useful in a wife. To the public, the match was a celebration of Iberian unity. To Ferdinand, it was a calculated gamble. The wedding was staged with deliberate opulence. Ferdinand stood at the altar, draped in cloth of gold, smiling just enough to project royal confidence, but behind the measured expression was a tightening knot of anxiety. He had already spent weeks in preparation, consulting his physicians, refining the design of the marital aids, even importing a rumoured Ottoman specialist who claimed to have assisted sultans with delicate matters. The real test, however, came after the feast, when the music faded and the courtiers withdrew. The first screams echoed through the palace not long after the chamber doors closed. These were not the ceremonial cries of a young bride feigning modesty. They were sharp, panicked, and real. Servants, rushing toward the source, were stopped by guards under strict orders. No one was to enter, but sound travels in marble corridors. and those who heard would remember the raw terror in Maria Isabel's voice. Accounts from her ladies-in-waiting written years later in letters never meant for public eyes described the aftermath. The bedclothes were blood-stained, a chair overturned, one of the custom supports broken in two. Maria Isabel was pale, trembling, and unable to speak more than a few halting words. Within days, she developed a stutter, flinching whenever the king entered a room. The young queen began to suffer what the court physicians delicately called hysterical episodes, fainting without warning, waking in the night screaming. Modern understanding would call them trauma responses. She lost weight, her skin becoming almost translucent under the heavy silks she was forced to wear in public. Ferdinand interpreted all of this not as the natural result of pain and fear, but as deliberate defiance. Her reluctance to share his bed was, in his mind, a personal insult, perhaps even part of a conspiracy. His paranoia, honed over years of humiliation, now turned on his own wife. He began intercepting her correspondence, having her food tasted, ordering her chambers searched for evidence of betrayal. The pressure to produce an heir intensified. Ferdinand commissioned increasingly bizarre medical consultations. Anatomists sketched diagrams of his body while offering improbable solutions, involving angled supports and timed intervals. A troupe of travelling performers was summoned to court after one claimed to be able to train the body through contortion techniques, a spectacle that horrified the palace physicians, but that Ferdinand pursued in earnest. In private, the royal bedchamber became less a place of rest than a laboratory for experimentation. Ferdinand permitted foreign medical observers to witness attempts at consummation, believing their insights might solve his problem. The humiliation was mutual. He endured their note-taking. Maria Isabel endured their gaze. Word of these indignities leaked in fragments to foreign courts, where they were repeated with the kind of relish only aristocratic gossip can carry. As the months passed without conception, the Queen's decline accelerated. Her attendants noted the glassy, faraway look in her eyes, the way she seemed to move through the palace as if already a ghost. Meals went untouched, prayers grew longer, whispered urgently in the shadows of her private chapel. Beyond the palace walls, Spain was beginning to feel the strain of Ferdinand's misrule. Colonial uprisings in the Americas were gathering strength, and revolutionary pamphlets were spreading through Madrid's streets. Yet in the royal mind, these were secondary concerns. The survival of the dynasty, or more accurately, the vindication of his masculinity, remained the king's consuming focus. In 1818, just 2 years after their wedding, Maria Isabel succumbed to what was officially recorded as nervous exhaustion. Among her ladies, it was whispered that she had willed herself into death, a release from a marriage that had been little more than a drawn-out horror. Ferdinand's reaction was not grief, but suspicion. He ordered multiple autopsies, questioned her attendants under threat of imprisonment, and searched for proof that her death had been engineered by enemies of the crown. He kept her death mask in his private chambers, speaking to it as if she might answer him not in affection, but in interrogation, and within weeks, the search for a third wife was underway. The cycle was set to begin again. Part 8. The Third Wife. Clinical matrimony with Maria Josepha. By 1819, Ferdinand's reputation as a husband had already become a diplomatic liability. The courts of Europe knew the fates of his first 2 wives, one dead from illness after years of trauma, the other from nervous exhaustion that was whispered to be something far darker. Potential matches declined politely, citing political differences or delicate health, but the truth was plain. No royal father wanted to send his daughter into a union that seemed to promise misery, and often death. It was desperation, not romance, that led Ferdinand's advisors to Saxony. The kingdom was mired in debt, its royal coffers dangerously thin. That vulnerability made the House of Wettin more receptive to an offer that others would have rejected outright. The chosen bride was Maria Josepha Amalia of Saxony, 24 years old older and more worldly than Ferdinand's previous queens. She was devout, serious-minded, and, crucially, well briefed on what awaited her in Madrid. Maria Josepha did not arrive with naive hopes of fairy tale marriage. Instead, she approached the task as a problem to be managed. Alongside her trousseau of gowns and jewels, she brought a private physician from Saxony, a small arsenal of ointments and medical instruments, and detailed written recommendations from doctors who had been discreetly informed of the king's unique challenges. The wedding was modest by royal standards, reflecting not just political fatigue, but a creeping awareness that the spectacle of Ferdinand's nuptials had become a morbid curiosity across Europe. Fewer foreign dignitaries attended, the celebrations were shorter, the toasts less effusive. The palace musicians played as sweetly as ever, but there was an unmistakable undercurrent, as though the entire court was holding its breath. On their wedding night, there were no screams audible in the corridors, no overturned furniture or dramatic outbursts. Instead, the encounter was methodical. Maria Josepha treated the king with clinical detachment, following a series of carefully planned steps agreed upon in advance with her physician. There was no romance, no pretension of mutual desire, only the slow, deliberate execution of a regimen meant to avoid injury and hopefully result in conception. This became the pattern of their marriage: scheduled intimacy, attended by physicians, with implements and supports laid out as precisely as surgical instruments. Every detail was recorded. Maria Josepha kept her own set of notes, not for posterity, but for the purpose of refining the process. Time of day, the king's physical condition, the specific arrangement of devices, all of it catalogued with almost scientific rigor. To Ferdinand, this pragmatism was infuriating. He began to suspect that his wife viewed him not as a husband, but as a medical specimen. His paranoia, already deep-rooted, now found a new target. The Queen's correspondence with her family in Saxony was intercepted, and any mention of treatment or difficulties was interpreted as an act of espionage. He accused her of secretly sending reports about his body to foreign physicians, feeding gossip that could be weaponized against the Spanish crown. Meanwhile, beyond the palace walls, Spain was unraveling. The Americas, once the source of the empire's immense wealth, were slipping away colony by colony. Independence movements in Mexico, Peru, Colombia, and beyond had already severed centuries-old ties. The loss of resources plunged the kingdom into economic crisis. Roads fell into disrepair, the army went unpaid, and bread riots erupted in provincial towns. Ferdinand, however, remained fixated on his personal mission. Cabinet meetings were delayed to accommodate his private appointments with Maria Josepha. Urgent petitions from ministers languished while he sought new devices, potions, and consultants from across Europe. It was as though the king could not, or would not, see the connection between his neglect of governance and the rapid collapse of his empire. A decade passed in this strange, clinical union. Then, in 1829, the impossible seemed to happen. Maria Josepha became pregnant. The news sent ripples through Madrid, then across Europe. For the first time in years, the Spanish court pulsed with genuine excitement. Ferdinand reacted with a mixture of elation and paranoia. The Queen was surrounded by an expanded retinue of guards. Her chambers were blessed by priests and sprinkled with holy water daily. Physicians from France, Italy, and Austria were summoned, each given overlapping authority not to improve medical care, but to ensure that no single doctor could plot against the pregnancy. For months, the palace lived in cautious hope. But in the 7th month, Maria Josepha began experiencing severe complications. Modern historians believe it was likely a placental abruption, a dangerous condition that even then could have been managed with calm and timely medical care. Instead, Ferdinand's erratic interference turned the situation into chaos. He dismissed one physician mid-treatment for showing insufficient reverence, replaced him with another who recommended chanting prayers over the Queen instead of attending to her symptoms, then brought in a self-proclaimed alchemist whose remedies included powdered emeralds. On May 18th, 1829, Maria Josepha went into premature labor. The ordeal lasted hours. The child, a daughter, survived only a few hours after birth. The queen lingered for 3 weeks, her body wasting away in a slow decline that ended with what was politely termed puerperal fever. Ferdinand's reaction teetered between denial and mania. He refused to allow the bodies to be buried, insisting the physicians attempt resuscitation long after it was impossible. The stench of decay spread through the palace, forcing servants to air the rooms at night. Finally, when reality could no longer be evaded, the coffins were sealed and the king withdrew from public view. He had now buried 3 wives and a child, and still had no heir. Spain, meanwhile, had grown poorer, hungrier, and angrier. But to Ferdinand, these were peripheral concerns. The throne, as he saw it, was incomplete without an heir of his blood. And so the search began again. Part 9. The Final Marriage. Maria Cristina and the child of another. Later in 1829, with Spain teetering on the edge of political and economic collapse, Ferdinand's ministers pressed for yet another marriage. The court had grown weary of funerals and diplomatic embarrassments, but the absence of an heir was a crisis too dangerous to ignore. Civil unrest simmered. Pretenders and rival claimants hovered like vultures. An heir, even a questionable one, could steady the Bourbon grip on the throne. Their choice was Maria Cristina of Naples and Sicily, a woman of strong will and subtle charm. What Ferdinand was not told until after the marriage was arranged, or perhaps chose not to confront, was that she was already pregnant when she arrived in Madrid. The child, due within months, could not possibly be his. But for a king who had spent decades failing at the one duty expected of him, the prospect of a ready-made heir was irresistible. The wedding was conducted with the pomp expected of royal unions, but there was a hollow quality to the celebration. Courtiers knew the truth. Ambassadors traded smirks behind lace-gloved hands. The Spanish public, desperate for stability, seemed willing to suspend disbelief. Ferdinand, whether out of desperation or denial, embraced the fiction. The child, born in 1830, and christened Isabella, was presented as his legitimate daughter, the hope of the Bourbon line. Behind the ceremonial smiles, however, the marriage was anything but harmonious. Ferdinand resumed his attempts at producing a biological heir, subjecting Maria Cristina to the same invasive routines that had defined his earlier unions. She endured the process with practiced composure, but it soon became clear to her that she was not a wife. In any meaningful sense, she was a political instrument, a placeholder, and a target for her husband's deepening paranoia. Ferdinand's obsession with control metastasized. He had secret passages built between their chambers, so he could arrive unannounced at any hour. Peepholes were drilled into the walls, and he was seen by servants crouched in the dark, one eye pressed to the opening, watching her as she nursed Isabella, prayed, or simply sat in silence. Meals became prolonged ordeals. Every dish was tasted by servants, who then had to wait under his watchful gaze to prove they had not been poisoned. Maria Cristina adapted by cultivating a serene, mask-like demeanor. In public, she was the dutiful queen. In private, she wrote desperate letters to her family in Naples, describing a life under constant surveillance, her movements and words measured against the king's suspicion. She likened her existence to a bird in a glass cage, seen by all yet unable to escape. Ferdinand's paranoia extended beyond his wife to the entire court. Guards were rotated daily, so no one could grow too familiar with palace routines. Ministers were tested with contradictory orders, their responses scrutinized for signs of treasonous intent. Even family gatherings became tense affairs, every glance and gesture interpreted through the lens of conspiracy. His obsession with Isabella's paternity bordered on madness. He spent hours staring at her, searching for some feature that might link her to him. Portrait artists were commissioned to paint her at various stages of infancy. The results compared side by side with likenesses of himself and of men Maria Cristina had known before her marriage. He consulted genealogists and physicians, demanding scientific proof of legitimacy that could never truly exist. Despite knowing she was almost certainly not his child, Ferdinand grew fiercely protective of Isabella, but in a way that was possessive rather than loving. To lose her would be to lose the fragile scaffolding of his legacy. Yet every time he looked at her, the unspoken truth gnawed at him. The crown's survival had been secured only by his failure. By the early 1832, Ferdinand's mental and physical health were deteriorating. His hands shook, his digestion was erratic, his nights were restless. The endless cycles of suspicion, control, and humiliation had drained even the most loyal courtiers. But the king pressed on with his nightly intrusions, his interrogations of servants, his elaborate systems of surveillance. Maria Christina, outwardly compliant, learned the art of quiet resistance, subtle evasions, coded letters, allies cultivated in the shadows. She understood that her survival depended on appearing useful to the king, while quietly insulating herself and her daughter from his worst impulses. Spain, meanwhile, continued to rot from within. The treasury was empty, the colonies were gone, uprisings brewed in the provinces. Yet inside the palace, Ferdinand's attention was fixed almost entirely on the woman he could not trust and the child he could not claim. The kingdom's crises were abstract to him. His own private obsessions were immediate, urgent, all-consuming. It was in these final years that the irony of Ferdinand's reign crystallized. He had achieved the outward trappings of succession, but at the cost of hollowing out his rule from within. The king who had spent a lifetime trying to secure his bloodline had, in the end, built his legacy on a lie one he could not stop himself from probing, even as it poisoned the last years of his life. Part 10. Death, Autopsy, and Legacy of a Perverted Throne. By the dawn of 1833, Ferdinand was a shadow of the man who had once returned from French captivity to the roar of an adoring Madrid. His gait had slowed, his back hunched, and his once imposing voice often gave way to a rasping croak. The paranoia that had defined his later years had eaten through what little remained of his health. He slept little, ate less, and surrounded himself with an ever-rotating guard of servants, physicians, and confessors, none of whom he trusted for long. His court had become a theatre of whispers and half-truths. Ministers avoided speaking his name in private, knowing the palace walls had ears. Maria Christina, by now a veteran of survival in the king's labyrinth of suspicion, moved through her days with mechanical precision, careful never to betray irritation or independent thought. Isabella, barely a toddler, was the object of Ferdinand's obsessive attention, a living reminder of both the crown's fragile continuity and his own lifelong failure. In the late summer of 1833, the king's health entered a rapid decline. Chronic gout left his joints swollen and inflamed. His digestive problems worsened. The tremors in his hands became constant. His physicians, knowing his distrust of any prognosis, couched their language in vague reassurances, even as they prepared for the inevitable. Ferdinand spent his final weeks drifting between lucidity and delirium. Some days he summoned ministers to accuse them of imaginary plots. Other days he sat in silence, staring at the death masks of his 3 dead wives, lined along a shelf in his private chamber. Servants whispered that he sometimes spoke to these masks as if conferring with an inner council, demanding their advice on matters of state. On the 29th of September, 1833, Ferdinand VII died. The official cause was listed as complications of gout, but those who had watched his decline knew it was more than that. Years of physical strain, psychological torment, and corrosive paranoia had finally worn him down. The King of Spain, the man who had made his anatomy a matter of statecraft, was gone. Death, however, was not the end of his scrutiny. Under the cover of secrecy, the royal physicians who had served him for decades gathered for an autopsy in the dim, lamplit chamber. The task was politically sensitive. The church insisted on discretion, and the palace feared what might be confirmed. What they found was as grotesque as rumour had promised. Preserved in medical drawings and notes, now sealed deep in the Vatican archives, Ferdinand's anatomy was measured and described in chilling detail. 14 inches in length, with a severe curvature and abrupt changes in girth from base to tip, irregular tissue growths that served no functional purpose, and deep internal scarring. These scars, the physicians realized, were not the result of nature alone, they were self-inflicted. It became clear that over the years, Ferdinand had attempted crude self-surgery, likely in secret, using whatever tools he could obtain, whether out of desperation to normalize himself or to improve his chances of fathering a child. These misguided operations had only worsened the deformities and left lasting damage. Here was the final, tragic irony. The king's lifelong quest to overcome his body had in part destroyed it. The organ itself, preserved in spirits, was locked away along with the sketches and written accounts, a royal relic too scandalous for public view. In the judgment of the Vatican custodians, it was a record of divine mystery and human frailty, unsuitable for the eyes of the faithful. Ferdinand's death left Spain in turmoil. Isabella II, barely 3 years old, was declared queen under the regency of Maria Cristina. Her legitimacy was quietly questioned in drawing rooms and diplomatic dispatches, though never openly in court. Within months, Spain was plunged into the First Carlist War as rival factions disputed the succession, tearing the kingdom into bloody halves. The empire Ferdinand had inherited was gone. The colonies that had once poured silver and gold into Madrid were now independent republics. The treasury was depleted, the army demoralized, the people weary of a monarchy that seemed to devour itself from within. Historians would later argue that Ferdinand's reign was not merely inept but catastrophically self-absorbed, a monarchy bent inward, its rulers' private dysfunction bleeding into every decision, every alliance, every betrayal. The story of Ferdinand VII became a cautionary tale about the dangers of concentrating absolute power in a man ruled more by insecurity than by vision. For all the wars, decrees, and political upheavals of his reign, it is his private life and the grotesque symbol of it, preserved in a jar that endures in historical memory. His anatomy, once a palace whisper, became an unspoken metaphor, oversized, misshapen, and ultimately incapable of fulfilling its intended purpose. As the royal physician who had been tasked with preserving that legacy years earlier, I sometimes wonder whether Spain would have been spared its ruin if Ferdinand had been born different. But history does not deal in what-ifs, only in what was. And what was, in the case of Ferdinand VII, was a throne deformed to match the man who sat upon it. In the end, the most perverted king in Spain's history achieved a kind of immortality, not through glory, not through conquest, but through the lingering shame of a secret too grotesque for even the history books to bear.